But it was the end of my final semester in grad school, the fall of 1985, that I just began to have doubts about my Christian faith. One day I just asked myself, could it be that the reason I'm a Christian is because I was brought up in the U.S. in a Christian family? What if I'd been brought up in a Muslim family in Afghanistan, or Hindu family in India, or a Buddhist family in Taiwan, or an atheist family in China? What would I think then? Maybe I've just convinced myself. I believe I've got this really close, intimate relationship with God, but do people of other religious traditions have that same kind of thought? Am I just deceiving myself? Maybe I should really look into this before I devote my entire life to Christianity, because people do get martyred and imprisoned and tortured for being a follower of Jesus all around the world. If I'm going to follow Jesus, I want to make sure that it's correct. I really wanted to get to the bottom line with this. Did Jesus really rise from the dead? If he didn't, I was going to walk away from my faith. Now, I could live with uncertainty. What I couldn't live with as a Christian would be if the evidence pointed strongly against the resurrection of Jesus. At that point, I believed, and I was ready to give up my faith.
Licona, so great to welcome you to the Bold Journeys podcast. I've been really eager to get you on the show ever since I saw you present at our church on the case for the resurrection. And that was just fascinating how you positioned it around John Lennon's Imagine, which is a song. It's a fun tune, but when you listen to the words, it definitely has different meaning than maybe what people think when they hear it. But I want to talk to you about the case for the resurrection that you created, but also first, just to find out a little bit more about you. You are the founder of Risen Jesus Ministries, and tell us more about that, what you're doing with that organization.
My wife and I founded this decades ago, and for Risen Jesus Incorporated, our mission is to present and defend the message and teachings of Jesus for those who doubt. Those who doubt would be Christians who are, doubting, wondering about their faith, the veracity of their faith, as well as skeptics who are looking into it. And we do that through three major pillars. One is through my research and writing, which also results in number two, lecturing and debating. I've had, I think it's 38 public debates at this point with skeptics, agnostics, atheists, liberal Christians, Muslims, and then also there's global reach. So I've written several books. Some of those have been translated into other languages like Korean, Indonesian, Spanish, French, a few different languages. Plus we have a website, risenjesus.com, and a YouTube channel. Our YouTube channel, we've got about 1,000 videos on it. The English one, we get about 1 million views a year. We also have a Spanish YouTube channel. So they have me presenting on there, but somehow they use AI to make my voice speak Spanish, and my mouth moves with it. So it all looks like I'm fluent in Spanish. So that's pretty cool.
That is pretty cool. How's your Spanish voice sound?
Oh, it's amazing. It sounds virtually just like my English voice.
Oh,
it sounds like
cool.
I'm speaking perfect Spanish. It's amazing. Now, I couldn't tell you whether the translation is correct, but I have our contractors they live in Latin America and Central and South America, and so I'm sure they're reviewing it, and hopefully they're making sure the translations are correct. But that's what we do: research, writing, speaking, and debating, and global reach. So that's what we do in our mission statement.
So where are you seeing the greatest interest in this topic as you're out speaking and talking with folks? Is there a particular generation or geography where you're seeing the greatest interest in this topic?
Well, most of where I speak are at conferences where you have all ages,
Yeah.
young adults up to older adults like us and even older. Um, but I do speak quite a bit on college campuses to college groups. So, it's hard to say because the conferences are mixed.
Yeah.
Um, sometimes I speak to high schoolers, even middle schoolers, but that's unusual. Most of
Yeah.
the stuff I do at college age and above. On college campuses, there's a lot of interest in this kind of stuff. You might not think so with an age and relativism, but, people who are really into relative morality, there are no moral absolutes. They're not consistent with their views. Of course, because if you don't agree with them that morals are relevant, and that there are no objective morals. In other words, there is nothing that is really, truly, intrinsically right or wrong. Morality is just a social construct. But if you disagree with that, they think you're wrong, right? Or if you stand against some of the ethics that they hold, like they're pro LGBTQ, then you're wrong, you're horrible, you're racist, you're homophobe, or something like that. Which, given their relativism, there'd be nothing wrong with it. You just have a different view than they are. But, so they do live inconsistently with that. But I typically find that, those same people who might have that kind of view, when it comes to something like history, then they do look at things as there are objective, either it happened or it didn't happen. Now, of course, there are postmodernists who are consistent, and they would say, history is just a matter of human construct. And either they'll be a radical postmodernist and say, nothing really happened in the past. It's how you construct in your mind how it happened. Some event happened, but interpretation of what actually happened, there is no right or wrong there. It's however you interpret it. That's a radical postmodernist. A more moderate postmodernist would just say, yeah, the event happened. There's just no way for us to know what actually happened. And they would just kind of poo-poo the whole discipline of history, or, to a large extent. But you don't find too many like that. Most are realists. They think that there was a past and that we can know the past to some extent. Um, I find even in mixed groups, like at conferences where you have college students and above, same thing. They're interested in this kind of stuff. Um, so now a lot of people aren't.
Yeah.
A lot of people
Yeah.
don't care about religion and philosophy and things like that. They just think the whole thing is just a matter of human construct, but few of them will actually engage in, intellectual, meaningful conversations to learn whether what they're actually claiming about there not really being any evidence for it is true.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Did you happen to see what took place yesterday on the National Mall? What do they call it? Rededicate 250?
I heard about it, but no, I didn't see it.
Yeah, it was pretty interesting, Mike. It was this day of praise and celebration of our religious foundings in the country. And yeah, it really was nice to see. I caught only a part of it, but they say there's a resurgence of faith, particularly in the younger generations in the country.
I'm hearing that
And
too, and we're
yeah,
seeing all kinds of sparks of spiritual renewal on college campuses all over the country.
yeah.
It's wonderful to see. I pray for this every day, that these sparks will just keep coming until it ignites a fire that sweeps across our nation of spiritual awakening. We need it because
Yeah,
this country is spiritually dead.
yeah, it is in many parts, Mike. I'm encouraged when I hear things like that, when I see what was taking place on our national mall. Those are signs of encouragement, but there still are a lot of doubters. So let's dive into your journey, your faith journey, and maybe go back into childhood. I'm curious, kind of your upbringing. Was it in a Christian household? What was it like for you growing up?
Well, I grew up in Baltimore, and my mom left my dad just a couple days before I turned 5 years old. Um, he was not a great dad. He was cheated on my mom, beat her, and so I don't think my sister and I. We didn't really wanna be around him, and my mom certainly didn't want to, so she left him. We moved in with my grandparents in 1966, and, we were, my mom started taking us to church on Sunday morning, and I can before we met, uh, and she started dating the guy who would become our stepdad, and, so I can remember, I don't know how old I was at the time, probably 7 or 8 years old, walking to church with my mom, and I asked her one Sunday on the way, I said, "Mom, how do I get to heaven?" And she said, "Well, you just do more good than bad." And I said, "Well, I've made my sis pulled her hair, hit my sister, younger sister, made her cry. What if I do more bad than good?" She said, "Well, then you go to hell to be with the devil forever." And I'm wondering, where am I on that scale right now? Um, but I did have an interest at a very early age about heaven and wanting to know how to get there. After my mom married my stepdad, he was a good man. We moved out to Baltimore County and we started to go to a Presbyterian church out there. And on one Sunday morning, I'm guessing it was in a June, I think I was 11 years old at the time. Um, they brought in a Christian magician and he was doing these magic tricks and he would relate the gospel to the magic tricks. And, you know, I don't know how he did it, but it's like for the first time I heard the message, it's not what we do that brings us salvation. It's what Christ did for us, and that we just have to fall at his feet and ask for mercy and tell him we want to follow him. We will follow him and become a follower of Jesus and ask him for eternal life, and he'll give it to us. And the magician gave an invitation, which I know is strange for a Presbyterian church, but he gave an invitation. This was just all the youth together, all the young kids in Sunday school. And three of us went forward. I thought, this is exactly what I've been looking for. And I went forward and I didn't care that hardly anyone else was going forward. It's like, this is what I want. And so I consider that to be the day that I came to know Christ. So yeah, that's how I came to know Christ, and didn't grow too much during my teens spiritually, but ended up going to a Christian university where I grew.
At 10 years old, Mike, that's amazing. I mean, I grew up in the church. Now I had a very different experience. My dad was in a very bad car wreck at age 12, and that he was very religious, but that really kind of interrupted my faith journey for many, many years. A lot of other interruptions tied to that as well, but that's just, oh, I'm just amazed and impressed that at age 10 you figured it out to that degree.
I don't know that I figured it out. I just wanted to know how to get to heaven.
Yes, you wanted it. Yeah. And so, and then what, did you have the typical teen rebellious years, or how did that go for you?
No, I was a pretty compliant child.
Yeah.
I'm kind of mellow. I just I'm pretty positive most of the time, and um, but I guess I wasn't on the social scale. There's the person who's really popular, and then there's the guy at the bottom. I was usually like the second, the first, not I wasn't at the bottom. I was the next guy up. My parents, they're good and they were well-meaning, but you're going to a public school in the city and then in the county, and everybody's dressing how culture's doing at that time. They're wearing blue jeans and t-shirts, and my parents are still stuck in the 50s, when they went to school, and so I'm wearing dress pants and a dress shirt, dress shoes. For a while, they even slicked my hair back like they used to do in the 50s. Nobody was doing it. And I had it cut real short because that's how they wanted it. And everybody else was in the 60s, and especially in the 70s, they were growing it long. And
Yeah.
so, I was like next to the last usually, wasn't really popular. I wasn't really that smart. And I had struggled with ADD and just found it really difficult to concentrate. So I didn't do well in school at all. I was a C student, even all the way up through high school. I didn't, to be honest with you, I didn't even know that I was going to graduate until about a week before. I guess I barely graduated. And then I must have done so poorly on the SATs that my first semester in college, they made me take English 100, which is basically 12th grade English. So, yeah, so that's kind of
Well,
my
in
underachievement story.
in spite of that, though, you went on, you became Dr. Mike, you got your PhD. At that time, what did you think you wanted to do? Did you have thoughts of a career or a profession?
Yeah, well, when I was in high school, my best friend and I, his name was Joe, and my best friend and I, we decided, what we wanted to do for a living. We either wanted to be an accountant or a state trooper. And it's like not even closely related, you know?
No, no.
In the fall semester, we both took accounting, and he went on to be an accountant, and I figured, that is not for me, so I'm gonna be a state trooper. But probably by the end of the spring semester in high school, my senior year, I'm thinking I want to be a professional jazz musician. I played saxophone. I was a pretty good saxophonist, actually. I played in the jazz band. We had a really good jazz band, finished second in the state, I think, of Maryland. I think we should have finished first, actually. But and I got in. I wanted to do bachelor's degree in music performance with saxophone with jazz. I was going to go to our local university, Towson University, and which had a great jazz program. But my parents, they said they had watched Jerry Falwell in the Old Time Gospel Hour, and they said he had a college for a weekend at Liberty Baptist College in Lynchburg, Virginia. And they said, Mike, would you like to try that? Why don't you just give it a try? I said, all right. So I went down there in April of 1979 and spent a long weekend, Thursday through Sunday, and it's like I loved it. It's like the people were so kind, and it's like getting ready one morning. I got out of the shower and shave and stuff, and my hair's still wet. And, oh, I don't have a hair dryer, and I went to a student in a dorm, and I said, "Could I borrow your hair dryer?" And he said, "Sure, brother, here." And I thought, wow, this is like Christian camp, but it's all year round. And I want to go here. This is just wonderful how nice these people are. And so I decided to do that. Unfortunately, they didn't have a jazz program, but I did it. I still learned musical performance with saxophone, classical music. And I figured I'd just go into music ministry and performance. And but the end of my education, I had just been growing in Christ, and I was praying about an hour to 2 hours a day. I was reading scripture about an hour a day. I was really just drawing close to the Lord. And that's when I decided I wanted to just get into the scriptures more, and didn't know what God wanted, but I wanted to be in ministry in some sort. And so I applied to grad school, got in on probation because I only had a high C average and they needed a B average, and I didn't have enough religion courses. But I took some courses over the summer, scored real high on my Greek entrance exam, and they let me in on probation. And then I just aced virtually everything.
You learned
Um,
Greek, Mike, in college?
my final semester, I used my last elective to learn one semester of Greek, and then I took a year's worth of Greek over the summer. And then I got in and I took like intermediate Greek. That was a year. And then advanced Greek grammar and rapid Greek reading and Septuagint Greek and 2 courses in Greek exegesis and textual criticism. So I was just eating it up. I just wanted to be able to read through the Greek New Testament and learn that way. But it was the end of my final semester in grad school, the fall of 1985, that I just began to have doubts about my Christian faith.
What do you know what caused that? What was the source of the doubt?
Wasn't anything that I had learned, Rob. It was kind of like one day I just asked myself, could it be that the reason I'm a Christian is because I was brought up in the U.S. in a Christian family. What if I'd been brought up in a Muslim family in Afghanistan, or Hindu family in India, or a Buddhist family in Taiwan, or an atheist family in China, or, et cetera? What would I think then? Maybe I've just convinced myself. I believe I've got this really close, intimate relationship with God, but do people of other religious traditions have that same kind of thought? Am I just deceiving myself? Um, Maybe I ought to really look into this a little bit before I devote I'm in my early 20s, mid 20s. Maybe I should really look into this before I devote my entire life to Christianity, because people do get martyred and imprisoned and tortured for being being a follower of Jesus all around the world. Um, if I'm going to follow Jesus, I want to make sure that it's correct. And so, yeah, that led me to really question my faith and to seek some answers.
That's so interesting, and it reminds me of when I read Lee Strobel's book. And now his was a little bit different story, right? He was an atheist, but his wife, I believe, was a believer, and he wanted to prove her wrong. So he started exploring it. And how long did it take you to, or did you just kind of naturally start doing more research and wanting to prove to yourself that it was actually true?
So it was my final semester in grad school, and I had a roommate who was doing a master's degree in Christian apologetics, and which is the defense of the Christian faith, intellectual arguments for the, positive evidence for Christianity, as well as addressing objections. And I had really had no interest in it. He'd talk about, this is what David Hume said, and this is, I'm thinking, well, Hume, when did he write? Oh, late 1700s. Buddy, this is the late 20th century, not the late 18th century. Why do I care what a guy in the 18th century had to say? I'm sure he's been answered since. Um, so yeah, I didn't really care about the apologetics, but when I started to doubt, have these questions, he said, "You ought to go see Gary Habermas. He might be able to help you." So I knocked on his office door. He invited me in, and we probably talked for 20 to 25, 30 minutes. And he focused on the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, and made sense. I just needed reassurance at the time, and walked out of his office feeling good again about my faith. But that only lasted so long. There would be times come up multiple times over the years when doubts would come up again. It'd be like, well, yeah, I got reassured, but I got what I was looking for. I was biased. I wanted reassurance that what I already believed was correct, and people of other religious traditions could do the same thing. So, is it really true? And you know, what if I were to do a case for the resurrection of Jesus, and look into this as a historian and be as open-minded and objective and as neutral as I'm capable of doing? What kind of research would that reveal? And that's kind of, I'm kind of conflating some stuff here to cut it
Yeah.
short, but that's what led me into doing doctoral research, which I never thought I would do. Remember, I was just a C student. I got B's in grad school, but I still struggled with the ADD, and I never thought I'd go for a PhD. Never desired to do it. Never really desired to teach in a university either. I just didn't want to do that. I didn't want to be an academic. I didn't want to be a scholar. That wasn't my objective. But I really wanted to get to the bottom line with this. Did Jesus really rise from the dead? If he didn't, I was going to walk away from my faith. Now, I could live with uncertainty. I could live with my conclusion being, it could go either way. I don't have enough evidence to confirm it, but the naturalistic alternatives aren't enough to disconfirm the resurrection. I could live with that. What I couldn't live with as a Christian would be if the evidence pointed strongly against the resurrection of Jesus. At that point, I believed, and I was ready to give up my faith. the way I fell on this and concluded it, whatever side I was going to fall on, could determine my eternity. And so that motivated me to make this as honest and an exhaustive, journey.
Yeah,
So,
big stakes,
yeah,
your eternity.
it's nothing to play around with.
No. Mike, your graduate studies, what were you getting a graduate degree in?
New Testament studies.
So you're studying the New Testament, becoming, for most of us, an expert on the New Testament, and yet you still had doubts. And I'm just thinking, there are so many of us in the world that have doubts about our faith. And if even a master's in New Testament studies graduate has doubts, that that's big, right? And I think, to me, it emphasizes the importance of what you embarked on from there.
Mm. Well, doubting is normal. John the Baptist had doubts. And even then, Jesus provided him with evidence. He encouraged him. And he complimented him because he said, in the midst of his doubting, when he's in prison and he sends those disciples to Jesus to say, "Are you the one, or are we to expect someone else?" Jesus heals some people, does some miracles in front of them. And he says, "Go back and tell John what you have seen and heard. The blind see, the deaf hear, the lame are raised, the lepers are cleansed, the lame are walking. The gospel is preached to the poor, and blessed are those who do not stumble on account of me." So he provided evidence, he provided encouragement. And then when the disciples left, everybody's now looking at Jesus. Your wingman here, Jesus, John the Baptist, the guy who's been pointing to you and telling everybody to come and follow you. He's doubting. And Jesus says, when you came out to hear John, what did you come out to see? A reed blown back and forth by the wind? He knew John was doubting. John was having emotional doubts, right? It's like he dedicated his life to serving God and living out there in the wilderness, eating locust and honey and dressed, like a wild man,
Yeah.
not living under the greatest conditions. And now Herod has thrown him into prison and he's waiting his execution. And it's like he's forgotten. Jesus just going ahead. He's not letting him out of prison. He's not coming to encourage him or anything. And John is having emotional doubt. Stuff that all of us can have at times when things aren't going our way. God, where are you? I'm serving you. I want to live for you. And I'm having some bad time and I'm praying and nothing is happening. It's like you have turned your back on me. What's going on? Well, that's what's happening with John. And Jesus gives him evidence. He encourages him. And then he tells the people, I assure you, no greater man has been born of woman than John the Baptist. He's complimenting him in the midst of his doubts. And so I got to think that, when we are experiencing doubts, Jesus isn't condemning us, but he has provided us with evidence.
What did you do? Where did you go for that evidence? What was kind of the process to prove to yourself the case for the resurrection?
Well, I had a lot of phone calls back then with Gary Habermas. We're talking about a time before email. And
was he was he like the expert on this at the time?
Oh yeah. And still is. He's the foremost authority in the world on this. He's been studying this since probably age 12, and he's going to be 76 this year,
Wow.
So he's been studying this a long, long time. In fact, his fourth volume of his magnum opus, his life work on the resurrection, is coming out. It might be this month. It's his final volume, and each volume is an average of 1,000 pages.
Wow.
So, yeah, so he is the foremost authority on this. So he and I would have discussions. We ended up in 2004 co-authoring a book together, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. I think the church that you met me at, where I spoke, gave out a bunch of free copies of that book the night I was there, I think to the first 40 or 50 people who came.
Yes. I showed up late, so I didn't get a copy.
No. Okay. Well, just contact me, and for $20, you can have
exactly. I know where to get one.
So, yeah, so we ended up co-authoring a book together, and that's where I was really learning. Plus, before that, I wrote one, self-published one in 1998 called Cross-Examined, which was a fictional story about kind of like the Scopes monkey trials, but it was the resurrection that was being debated rather than creation evolution. And I sold that when I spoke. My speaking was just ministry was just getting started. I sold a couple thousand copies of that. It's no longer available, but that was fun. So that made me really work through some stuff. And then short, maybe a month after I started my doctoral research, I engaged in my first public debate, enjoyed it a whole lot. And then I got, invited to debate more. And, now I've had, I think, 38 debates and public debates, and I enjoy them. I might be starting to step away from them a little bit now. I've debated everybody I've wanted to, actually, or just about everyone. And they take a lot of preparation. I want to focus on some more research and writing now for a while.
Can you share the sources of your research? You didn't go just to the Bible. There's a lot of historical reference to the resurrection. Where did you find that? And did you have to use your Greek to read them?
Well, the primary sources, of course, are going to be the Christian literature in the New Testament, because
Yeah.
that's our earliest, first century. They have reasonable claims to have been written by eyewitnesses and those who knew the eyewitnesses, or to have been rooted in eyewitness testimony. Um, So those are going to be, yeah, and I read those in Greek. Then you've got some other primary sources that would be, things like Josephus, who's also written in the first century. You've got some other non-Christian sources like Tacitus, a Roman historian writing in the early second century, Lucian Marbar Serapion, some non-Christian sources like that will give us some things like that talk about the death of Jesus, or things that are consistent with what we find in the Gospels and in Paul's letters about the fate of Jesus's death and what may or may not have happened afterward. Then I'm reading a lot the secondary sources and academic sources on the subject. There's been tons of literature. Gary Habermas has, in his magnum opus, he's consulted about 5,500 academic sources written in English, French, and German on the resurrection of Jesus since 1975. Now, my research started around consulted scholarly sources from 1985 up until about, I'm guessing 2007. And so I got an idea, a pretty good idea. I didn't do any bean counting, but I have a really good hunch about where scholarship is on these things. My bibliography is like 55 pages long. Most of those things I've consulted to some
Hmm.
extent,
Yeah.
if not read the whole thing. So, yeah, read where scholars are, because, they're going to dig into some things. They may see some things that I don't see. And because I was just at that point a budding freshman scholar, on this stuff, I've already written a couple books on this and really worked on the resurrection. But, these folks who they got their doctorates, they've been studying this for years, decades. They're going to know some things that I don't know, and I want to learn from them. So I got to look at the pros, the cons, the rebuttals, the rejoinders, and really think through this stuff. And then one other thing I'd say that I did, which I found to be very beneficial for me, was I purposefully engaged in public debates with some of the leading skeptical scholars in the world, on the matter of the resurrection of Jesus. And the reason I did that was, not only was it fun, but um, they were not going to let me get away with bad arguments. I had my blind spots. I would have a tendency to accept the credibility of, let's say, the Gospels or a Christian source um, far sooner than the skeptic would, and maybe sooner than I should. I may not be objective enough to require enough evidence, supporting evidence before I believe something. I may accept it too easily. The skeptic, on the other hand, may be too skeptical. They've got their own weaknesses. They've got their own biases. So, but what I wanted to do was I wanted them to point out problems in my view, in my methodology. And then I could either jettison something that I was arguing or believing, or strengthen it somehow, or know that it was good because it would withstand the critical scrutiny. So while I'm doing my doctoral research, I'm not only publishing some in peer-reviewed articles, but I'm debating some of the top critical minds out there on this to see how they respond, and then I can adjust and fine-tune my arguments along the way, and enjoying it too.
Yeah,
So, yeah, that was really, really helpful.
I bet. You're honing your thinking, your defense
Mhm.
as you're creating it.
Yeah, as I'm preparing for the debate, I'm thinking, okay, if I say this, what's my opponent going to say? What could they say? What have they said in their writings? Bart Ehrman, probably the most influential skeptical New Testament scholar in the world, or at least here in North America. If I give this argument, what's he going to say in response? And how would I address that? I might be able to get away with that in a Sunday school class, but in a public debate, he's going to crush me. If he could crush me if I say this. So I'm going to really have to, bolster that argument, make it stronger, or put it aside and use something else. And Bart and I we've had 8 debates now, and we have since become friends. So, but having those debates with him and others helped me a whole lot to develop my own historical argument for the resurrection of Jesus and to be able to contend with the objections that they offer.
Yeah, I bet. Before we get to the proof or case of the resurrection, how about just people who say, well, how do we even know that Jesus lived? I mean, do you get that argument?
Not from scholars.
No, but from the
I mean,
everyday.
from people who are publishing on the internet and, skeptics. And it's like, just because you publish on the World Wide Web does not make you a world-class scholar. All you have to do to be able to publish on the web is breathe, and communicate your own thoughts. And they don't even have to be good thoughts. But there aren't many scholars in the world who even question Jesus' existence. Richard Carrier is probably the foremost of them. He's a legitimate historian, has his doctorate in history from Columbia University. And the last count I saw of his was maybe 13 living people, scholars in the relevant fields who question whether Jesus existed. Some of them won't deny his existence. They even just question it. And some of them deny it. So, I mean, that's it. Out of, thousands of historians, theologians, and philosophers in the world who can really, have some kind of tools and training in this to assess arguments, and know the relevant data. You got 13 in the whole universe who even questions Jesus' existence. There are more scientists who think the Earth is 10,000 years or younger, bona fide scientists, than there are scholars who question whether Jesus existed, living scholars. So, no, there's just too much evidence for it. We have mentions of Jesus not only in the early Christian sources, which we can look at and say, well, some of them are multiple independent sources. They're early sources. Some are rooted in eyewitness testimony. You have, unsympathetic sources like Josephus, Tacitus, Lucian, Bar Serapion. None of them are Christians. They acknowledge of it, Jesus' existence. So you have all this kind of evidence from, early eyewitness, multiple independent sources, unsympathetic sources. It's like the best kind of evidence you could ask for. And it's, all the kind of pushback on it from these skeptical scholars. They're not very good, and they involve a ton of speculation and faulty reasoning. And that's why far and wide, it's very difficult to find even a very skeptical scholar who even questions Jesus' existence. People like Morris Casey, who died within the last few years, who was an agnostic bordering on atheism. And he wrote a book just scolding those who questioned Jesus or denied his existence. Bart Ehrman has written a book scolding those. He's an atheist, and he's scolding those who question the existence of Jesus. There have been others as well, non-believers. It's not a respectable position among scholars to even question whether Jesus existed.
Yeah. Let's get into the case for the resurrection then, Mike. Can you walk us through, I think you had 4, maybe 5 primary, very sound cases that defend the truth of the resurrection. Could you walk us through those?
Yeah, look, there's a lot of different ways, several ways that I could approach this. Let me
Yeah.
just try to make it fairly simple, kind of like I did at the church.
Yeah.
Um,
That
but I think it's
us
a pretty
common folks
strong.
can digest it.
Well, that way it's more memorable. You know what I mean?
Yes.
I could get into some other stuff, which everybody would comprehend, but you're not going to walk away with it. You'll walk away thinking that's pretty cool, but I want people to walk away not only thinking it's pretty cool, but they'll remember some of it. So I start with Paul. And the reason I like Paul is because you could trash the Gospels all you want. Now, I believe the Gospels are historically reliable, meaning that they give us at minimum an essentially faithful representation of what occurred. But if you go with all the major objections against the Gospels, I could grant all of those and say, look, I'm not even going to use the Gospels. I'm going to use Paul. And here's why I like Paul. Paul is an early writer. He may be the earliest in our New Testament. He may be writing before all of the Gospels, certainly all but maybe Mark, but he might be writing before all of them. So it's early. We got 13 letters in the New Testament attributed to Paul, and scholars are unanimous that he wrote at least 7 of them. So what if I only appeal to those 7? Then it's like, okay, we got very early, and we know Paul wrote them. Okay, so it's not like, well, I don't believe Paul wrote that. Nope, well, we got good evidence Paul wrote it. And what's also nice is Paul was not a biased Christian follower of Jesus prior to this. He was a skeptic. He was out persecuting Christians, arresting them, throwing them in prison, consenting to their executions for being Christian. And then he becomes one when he has an experience he's convinced is the risen Jesus appearing to him. And that experience radically transforms his life from being a persecutor of the church to one of its most able defenders. Now, you think about today. I mean, it's hard to imagine that, how valuable this is. But you think about whether you like Donald Trump or not. Okay, let's just use the example. You got Donald Trump as president, and you take the person who pushes back the most against him, which until recently was Nancy Pelosi, but now she's out, and it's like, okay, Chuck Schumer. Okay, what if Chuck Schumer someday here in the United States, the Senate minority leader, he says, you know what, I've been wrong all this time, and now I see clearly, and Trump is correct, and I am supporting him for president this next election. We have to have him. That's a radical transformation. Or an example I was given before the war with Iran is saying, what if the Ayatollah in Iran all of a sudden came to the conclusion that Islam is a false religion. Muhammad was a false prophet. He converts to Christianity. He says, Jesus appeared to me and he told me, follow me. I am the Messiah, the Son of God. And he gives up Islam and he's telling all of these Muslims, you need to follow Jesus, to the point where he gets stoned. That's the kind of radical transformation that we're talking about with Paul. And then through Paul's undisputed letters, we know that he went to Jerusalem and spent time with some of the Jerusalem apostles. And he named some: Peter, James, and John. Now, Peter and John were 2 of Jesus' 3 closest disciples while Jesus was ministering here during his ministry. and James was the brother of Jesus. Now you imagine hanging out with two of Jesus' three closest disciples and Jesus' brother, and running your message past them to make sure you're right on and in agreement on the gospel message with them, and that they actually certify that what you're proclaiming is right on message with what they're proclaiming. That is what we have with Paul. And he gives us that gospel message in 1 Corinthians 15, an undisputed letter of Paul, and it talks about the death, burial, resurrection, and appearances. And then we also know from 5 sources from the first century that Paul was one of several disciples who suffered continuously and even to the point of being martyred for their gospel proclamation, which testifies to their sincerity. Now, you could say maybe what they had was a hallucination, but it's not a lie. It's not a legend because it's from the very beginning, not a legend that developed over time. It's not a lie because they were willing to suffer continuously. Liars make poor martyrs. So you might have one that's willing to die and suffer and even die for a known lie, but all of them. Yet we know from the first century writings that all of them were persecuted for their teaching, the message and teachings of Jesus, for following him, and they were willing to die, and at least several of them did die as martyrs.
Yeah,
so you
and
got to
Paul,
explain those experiences. What led them to conclude that Jesus had risen and appeared to them? And that's where nobody questions that. They had these experiences that led them to believe Jesus rose and appeared to them. Paul and Jesus' disciples, and we know Jesus' disciples through Paul. So what led them to, what was the nature of those experiences? And that's where the historian will step in once again to assess various hypotheses.
and Paul was writing those letters, many of them from prison, for his
Correct.
faith.
Yes.
So you start with Paul and the others that were died. Didn't all of the disciples end up being martyred for their faith?
There are reports that all of them were martyred for their faith, but some of those reports are late. All right. Historians look for early sources. Well, like I said, we've got 5 from the first century. So if Jesus dies in the year 30, let's say it's either 30 or 33, that's within 70 years. We have 5 sources. That's pretty good by ancient standards. And some of them, well, Paul is an eyewitness. He claims to be an eyewitness of the risen Jesus, and he's talking to those. He knows those who are eyewitnesses. And we've got some others who knew the eyewitnesses and their writings saying that this is what the disciples were claiming and what happened to them, the persecution and martyrdom. So, so some of them, it may be true that all of them died as martyrs, but we're looking for probability here. And I think we can know, in my studies, I've concluded that Peter, Paul, and James, the brother of Jesus, they died as martyrs. And I think James, the son of Zebedee, I think there's good evidence of that we find in the book of Acts, that he died as a martyr. I also think we've got really good evidence. Oh, plus Josephus, first century, non-Christian Jewish historian. He talks about the martyrdom of James, the brother of Jesus. So you've got those, but you've got these other sources that from the first century that say they are all willing to suffer for it. Some of the others, they may be true, they may not be. What do we know about John? I kind of lean toward John dying as a martyr. My friend Sean McDowell, who did his doctoral dissertation on it, and I admit he's done more work on it than I have. He doesn't think John was martyred. The reason I think it is because in Matthew and Mark, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to Jesus and said, "We'd like you to make it so we sit on your right and left when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus says, "Can you drink the cup I'm about to drink and be baptized with the baptism of which I'm about to be baptized?" He's talking about his suffering and death. And they said, "Yes, we can drink it and eat," and, and he says, "Well, you will drink this cup, and you will be baptized with that baptism. But to put you on my right and left, that's up to my Father.
Yeah.
So to me, that seems to suggest that they would both be martyred. And we know that James, the son of Zebedee, was martyred, according to Acts chapter 12. So why not John? But my friend Sean, he cites some other evidence that thinks that John died a natural death, and maybe he did. It just becomes difficult. If we're going to do, serious historical investigation, we're going to have to leave something, just like in anything else, any other kind of historical investigation. You're just going to have to leave question marks and say, I just don't know. But we do know that they were all willing to be persecuted, suffer persecution for their gospel proclamation. And we know that a few of them, at least a few of them, died as martyrs. And the fact that when your colleagues are dying for proclaiming the gospel, and you go ahead and you're proclaiming continue to proclaim it as well, it shows that you're willing to face the same fate. It's kind of like in Europe, where like the UK and others in Europe, Scotland, Ireland, where they are imprisoning people for retweeting a post that may say something negative about the government or in disagreement with a government policy. If you see your neighbor arrested for doing that, and then you turn around and you retweet the same tweet, I guess that's what you call them now, even though it's X, but you retweet the same tweet, that means that you are willing to suffer the same fate as your neighbor, even if it doesn't happen to you.
Yeah, exactly. Jesus' brother James, he was a skeptic at first. What's the story there?
Well, you have the end of Mark chapter 3, and Jesus is teaching a crowd in Capernaum, and the house in which he's teaching is just overflowing. And his brothers hear about this, and Mark says they thought he was beside himself, so they came to get him. So that's kind of interesting.
Our brother needs help.
Yeah. And then you go to John chapter 7, the first verses in it. And it says that, I think it's the Feast of Tabernacles, something like that, was coming up. And all the Jews are going to Jerusalem. And his brothers said to him, hey, why are you doing all your miracles in secret, just in front of your disciples? Why? Oh, this is after. It said the Feast of Tabernacles were coming up, and the Jewish leaders were seeking a way to put Jesus to death. So his brothers came to him and said, why are you doing your miracles, just for your disciples? And they need to be publicly in front of everyone. So come with us. Jesus said he wasn't going. So why don't you come with us to Jerusalem so you can do all these miracles in front of others? Because none of his brothers believed in him. So in other words, they're saying, look, the Jews are looking to kill you in Jerusalem. So why don't you come to Jerusalem and do some miracles? Yeah, we don't believe in you, you coward. Why don't you come in? If you really are who you claim to be, come on. And then you come to the end of Jesus' crucifixion in John 19. Who's there? Who does Jesus entrust the care of his mother to at the cross? To his beloved disciple. Well, who would Jesus tend to entrust the care of his mother to? Well, it should have been one of his brothers, right? And if James and his other brothers are around, why wouldn't he give the care to his mother to them? Well, it just seems that they were not followers at the time, and he wanted his mother to be in the care of a spiritual brother when none of his brothers were following him. So I think there's really good evidence to suggest that none of Jesus, in other words, there's the criterion of embarrassment. If you're making up a story, would you make up something that's embarrassing? Like none of his brothers believed in him. His brothers thought he was beside himself. You wouldn't make that stuff up. Like if his brothers who grew up with him wouldn't believe in him, why should I? Maybe they know some stuff I don't know. But no, you do that because you're just reporting the facts.
Yeah. So it took after the resurrection for James to become a believer.
That's right. At Pentecost, just before Pentecost, we find in Acts chapter 2 They're all gathered together. Jesus' disciples and his mother and brothers are there
Yeah.
at Pentecost. And then, um, shortly after that, you find James as leader in the Jerusalem church. And then you have Josephus, Hegesippus, and Clement of Alexandria reporting that he was martyred because he wouldn't deny that his brother's the Messiah. Well, what would it take to convince you that your brother is the Lord? I think the answer is found in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. I believe it's verse 7, when it says, "Then he appeared to James."
That would do it. What what did you learn when you looked into the actual crucifixion? And I remember you sharing with us, there were people even who doubted whether he died on the cross.
Well, not, let's see. I don't think we saw much in antiquity of people die or doubting. Um, it could have been Celsus in the middle of the 2nd century, who was a skeptic, who wrote against Christianity. He may have doubted that Jesus died, but I'm not aware of any really strong contention from antiquity. They doubted the cause of the empty tomb. Like in Matthew, you find Matthew saying that the Jewish leaders were spreading around that the disciples had stolen the body while the guards slept. Justin Martyr, in the middle of the 2nd century, in his dialogue with the Jew Trypho, who was a philosopher, they're both philosophers, he said, "You yourself know, Trypho, that the Jewish leadership has chosen and ordained certain men to go around and say the disciples stole the body." You have Tertullian at the end of the 2nd century saying that it was being passed around that the gardener had reburied the body because he had a lettuce patch there among the tombs, and he figured that people coming to venerate Jesus's tomb might trample over his lettuce patch, so he reburies the body. You even have Mary Magdalene in John's gospel. She goes and she sees that the tomb is empty, and Jesus says, "Why are you crying?" And she says, "What, she thinks it's the gardener, right?" She says, "Where have you taken the body? Let me know so that I can go and retrieve it." So you've got reburial and you have stolen body in antiquity. That he didn't die, that might come in the 2nd century with the Ethiopic apocalypse of Peter, which had the weird view that Jesus, the human Jesus, and the divine Christ were two different people. And the divine Christ inhabited the body of the human Jesus. And when they put Jesus up on the cross, Christ came out, and Peter sees him, and Jesus is laughing. Christ is laughing
Yeah.
because the Romans and the Jewish leaders thought they had crucified Christ. No, they crucified Jesus, but they weren't able to touch the Christ. And then later on, you've got the Quran in the 7th century that says that God made it appear that they crucified Jesus, but they really didn't. And then there's a couple of different interpretations of what actually happened. But surviving crucifixion, for a little bit, that's been one of the alternate hypotheses that came after, the early church, but nobody really takes that today. No, I'm not aware. There's a woman named Barbara Teering, a really radical leftist scholar. I don't know if she's still alive. She might be. She's about the only bona fide scholar I know who thinks that that Jesus survived his crucifixion. Then he married Mary Magdalene, and they went off to Germany or France and had kids. But she thinks that they came, and after Jesus was in the tomb, barely hanging on to life, they put some aloe and other herbs on him, and that healed him. But even though some herbs may have medicinal properties to them, there's nothing we're aware of that would revive a person from being scourged and crucified, and especially make them look whole and in complete health within just a couple of days. If there were, we'd be using them today.
Yeah. 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 You described in a lot of detail the horrific death that you go through on the cross,
Yeah.
which makes you appreciate Jesus even more. What do you say when speaking with people of other faiths, Muslims, Hindus, even Jewish who are not believers in the resurrection or Jesus as the Messiah?
Well, I haven't had an opportunity to talk to many Jews on it, but those I have, what I have said to them is their big thing is, um, we don't believe Jesus because he didn't fulfill prophecy. And my response to that is, well, according to our New Testament and our understanding of those prophecies, he did fulfill some prophecies, some really good ones, especially those in Isaiah.
Hmm.
Um, and you may not interpret them in the same sense, but if Jesus rose from the dead, which I think we do have some good historical evidence that he did, and no good alternative explanations that even come close to the resurrection hypothesis, the strength of it. If Jesus rose from the dead, I'm going to go with his interpretation over your interpretation of those prophecies. But the evidence for the resurrection has been so compelling that, like one Jewish scholar, Pinchas Lapid, um, he came to the conclusion Jesus did rise from the dead, but he said, well, that just shows he's not Messiah. He's the savior of the Gentiles, but we're still waiting for Messiah. So, um, yeah, that's kind of neat. But it does, at least he was honest about the evidence we have for the resurrection of Jesus. For Muslims, I focus on um, what I call the Islamic catch-22 argument. I've been doing this since about 2006, where I say, look, we can show historically. So, look, you've got your book, I've got my book. You got the Quran, I've got my Bible. We can just say, well, our books, we believe they're inspired by God, and so therefore we believe them. But I don't believe your book. You don't believe my book. So I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to offer some historical evidence. So here are 6 arguments that support the historicity of Jesus's prediction about his imminent death. His imminent death. I mean, it's going to happen there in the first century. Okay. So 6 historical arguments, actually 5 historical arguments and 1 theological one. So 6 arguments that Jesus predicted his imminent death. Now, if Jesus did not die as he predicted, then that makes him a false prophet. And therefore, the Quran is mistaken because the Quran says that Jesus was a great prophet. On the other hand, if Jesus did die, if he was crucified and died as a result, as he predicted, well, then in that case, the Quran is false because it says that he didn't. Either way, the Quran is mistaken. And the only way out of that really is to say, well, I don't believe Jesus predicted his imminent death. And I'd say, well, I've given you several historical arguments and a theological one that he did. You have to refute all of those. Give me some reasons. Don't just say that he didn't do it. Give me some reasons to think that he didn't.
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah, I have friends who are Muslim, and I'm thinking about how to have that conversation, or with anyone. What what are some tips for us non-scholars to have this conversation with others and to share the case for the resurrection?
Well, I'd say try to make it as simple as possible because you're not going to remember everything unless you devote your life to this. I've got, the one, just read on it. You can go to my YouTube channel. I've got debates on the resurrection, lectures on it. Watch some of that stuff and take notes and come up with your own argument for the resurrection of Jesus. It just takes time. The one that I gave at the church about how to share the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus on a napkin. I've got that lecture that I do around the country. I'm hoping to write a book on it. Hopefully I can finish it by the end of this year or sometime next year, and then, be published within a year after that. That'll make it easy to be able to learn it and share it with others.
Yeah, I like ones, Mike, that I can do it with a thick marker on a napkin. That's that's about my speed. All right. I've got a rapid fire round that I prepared for you. Just some quick answers to a couple questions here. Now, the first one may not be a quick answer, but what do you think is harder for people, believing in God or believing in Jesus?
Well, it depends what you mean by believing in Jesus. What are they believing in Jesus?
Yeah.
They believing he was just a great man or believing he's the son? If you believe he's the son of God, you also have to believe that a God exists.
This is true. This is
And
true.
I would say, but generally speaking, I'd say, if you're thinking about Jesus claims to be God's uniquely divine son, then it's going to be easier for someone to believe in the existence of God because it's simpler, right? You just have to believe in God. Whereas to believe in Jesus as the divine son of God, you got to believe God's existence and Jesus claims about himself.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, as a Christian, what's your favorite Bible verse that gives you strength if you still have any periods of doubt or you need some fortitude?
That's a good question. I don't know that I have any favorite Bible verses. I mean, there's a bunch of them I like. Right now, I'm spending quite a bit of time in Proverbs, and I'm just learning. Proverbs talks about, you know, I if you want to live a successful life and come out of your simplicity, God is willing to give you wisdom and understanding and knowledge, but you have to seek it. And God will give it to you, but you have to seek it and seek for it as treasure like silver, gold, and rubies, because it's more valuable to you than silver, gold, and rubies. So I took that seriously, starting in December. And I thought, wow, do I really believe that it's more important? Well, of course it's more important than silver, gold, and rubies because, um, it can help you live a successful life. And, there's a lot of wealthy people out there, but they're miserable. But if you're wise, you can live a life that is pleasing to God and be satisfied. So what is wisdom? What is understanding? What is knowledge? And if it is more valuable than silver, gold, and rubies, and God wants to give it to me, why don't I take that seriously and seek it daily, waiting daily at wisdom's doorsteps to learn? So I do. I'm reading about Proverbs and reading Proverbs and cataloging and stuff every day since December. I'm going through this. I've been learning some really good stuff. So I don't know that I have a favorite verse, but right now I'm really enjoying Proverbs.
Yeah, I think I'm the same way. It just depends on, month by month, year by year, what is really captivating me and what I'm dealing with in my life, good and bad. Is there
I
a
did
you
like
mentioned
I did
Go
like
ahead.
Second Corinthians when it says God has chosen the foolish things in this world to confound the wise, the weak to confound the strong. Again, I got an average IQ. I struggled with ADD for most of my life until my early to mid 40s, and here I am. Debated these people, top scholars in the world. I think I've done pretty well against them, and um, so yeah, that's pretty cool that it's not from the wisdom of man, or he doesn't have to use someone who's extremely sharp. You just have to be willing and put in the work. It doesn't mean you're not going to have to do the work. I work hard. Um, so you have to put in the work and work with God. We are his co-workers.
Yeah, never underestimate God's plan. Here, like you said, you never would have imagined back when you were struggling in high school that this is where
Oh,
you'd end up.
no way. Not even in college.
Yeah. Amazing. All right. Is there a moment when you felt God's presence most clearly in your life?
Yeah, there've been a couple of those. We really struggled financially in you know, I don't know, more than 20 years ago. And it's like we really struggled over that. I just was having a really tough time providing for the family, and it was just up and down a roller coaster ride. And sometimes it seemed that the more I prayed, the worse it got. And people would ask me afterward, friends of mine, well, I guess God taught you some things through it. And I said, no, I don't think I learned a single thing through this. When we were out of it, I don't think I learned a single thing through it. I can't think of a single thing why he did it. And then one day I'm walking through the house not even thinking about it. And boom, it's like God spoke to me. I didn't hear the words, but the message was clearly as clear as the words themselves were in my mind, why God had put us through that. And I'm not going to say what that was, um, but uh, but it was really clear. And then just this last fall, in preparation for my debate with Bart Ehrman on who wrote the Gospels, which it was video recorded. It's on uh, my YouTube channel, um, and if someone wants to watch it. But in preparation for that, there was a time in prayer that God spoke to me. Um, Again, I didn't hear any words, but it was clear as day in my head. Um, and it was just an amazing moment of intimacy with God that resulted. And so, yeah, there have been a few times in my life in which I have clearly heard God, and maybe a handful of times, and have been really special.
That's awesome. I'm waiting for that. I'm waiting for those moments. That's amazing. Dr. Mike, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this conversation. It's been such a pleasure chatting with you, and I want to thank you for coming on the show. You've got a number of places where people can reach out to you. Any last words of advice for anyone listening who's maybe like you at that stage you were at of really struggling and doubting their faith?
There's no shortcuts. So pray, and get knowledge. I've got several videos on my YouTube channel. We got a playlist about doubt. You can go, there's several videos on there. If you're struggling with doubt, you can go there and watch those videos. They can prove helpful. I've got, most of my debates, at least all of them, in which I was permitted to post. I've got them on our YouTube channel. I think one is a written debate that's coming out in a book later this year. So you got to be a voracious reader, watch videos. If you really want to get into this, where I teach at Houston Christian University, we offer a master's degree in Christian apologetics that you can do at a distance. You can do it entirely online. Just go, if you want more information on that, go to HC for Houston Christian, hc.edu/defend. You can also go to my website, risenjesus.com. It's
Awesome.
been a
Awesome.
pleasure talking to you, Rob.
Yeah, thank you guys. If you're listening and if you know anyone else who would benefit from this conversation, please share it. I think it's very valuable, something I hope everybody can listen to. Mike, thanks again.
My pleasure, Rob. God bless you, brother.
God bless you.